On February the 28th, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion, coordinated surprise strikes across Iran. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in the opening salvo. His compound destroyed. Dubai's airport took Iranian retaliatory fire. The Strait of Hormuz is choked with mines and missiles. Oil prices are through the roof. And the talking heads have their scripts out. Escalation, proxy war, flashpoint. Every one of those scripts is wrong. What's unfolding in the Persian Gulf is not about Iran, not really about the Middle East. And it has almost nothing to do with great power competition against Russia or China. This is the latest theater in a war that's been running for 400 years. A war inside the English-speaking world, now reaching its endgame. Part 1. The spectacle. Here is what the world is being told. Trump calls it a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America. He tells Iranians the country will be yours to take, and says this is probably your only chance for generations. Netanyahu says the aim is to remove the existential threat permanently. Kaine calls it a colossal mistake and dangerous, unnecessary, and idiotic. Finland's president says the United States is operating largely outside traditional international law. American service members are already dead. Standard framing, another American intervention, another Middle Eastern crisis. Stop there, and you miss what's actually happening. The headlines, the outrage, the cable news panels, all of it amounts to a catastrophic misread. To make sense of why a head of state was assassinated in his own compound and an entire region set ablaze, you need a different lens. Not geopolitics, not counter-terror doctrine, history. Specifically, a 400-year English civil war that is now entering the crisis phase of its final great cycle. Iran as symptom. The stated reasons are familiar. Nuclear ambitions, proxy militias, threats to shipping, decades of regional destabilization. This was already the second round. Last June, the US and Israel hit Iran's nuclear facilities during the 12-day war. The Pentagon said that set the program back 2 years. In January 2026, the regime killed thousands of its own protesters in the largest uprising since 1979, and Trump pledged that help was on the way. Then, on February 6th, indirect nuclear talks opened in Muscat, mediated by Oman. On February the 27th, one day before the bombs fell, Oman's foreign minister announced a breakthrough. Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium, to downgrade existing stocks to the lowest level possible, and to accept full IAEA verification. He said peace was within reach. Talks were set to resume March the 2nd. The next morning, the strikes began. Afterward, the Omani mediator said he was dismayed that active and serious negotiations had been undermined. The official line is the talks failed, but they didn't fail. Or, a different reading, they succeeded. And City of London-aligned factions inside Iran and the wider region refused to honor what was agreed. That refusal is why the missiles are flying. Hold that contradiction. For weeks, Washington simultaneously built what Trump called an armada. The carriers Abraham Lincoln and Gerald R. Ford, thousands of troops, the largest Middle Eastern buildup since 2003, while also negotiating. A state with one foreign policy doesn't do that. An empire with two capitals and two competing agendas does. And watch the other great powers. Russia condemned the strikes as a pre-planned and unprovoked act of armed aggression. Putin called Khamenei's killing a cynical violation of all norms of human morality. China's foreign minister called it unacceptable and condemned the blatant killing of a sovereign leader. Strong words. But neither power has moved to Iran's direct military defense. Russia is reportedly feeding Tehran satellite imagery and drone targeting data to help its retaliation, but it won't confront Washington directly. They're not behaving like allies defending a principle. They're behaving like interested parties managing a situation they recognize as fundamentally an internal English-speaking drama. Think Rome and Constantinople in the 3rd century. This is what we're looking at. English Civil War 3.0. The geopolitical rivalries on the surface aren't the main event. They're the smokescreen, while a 400-year power struggle among English-speaking elites enters its final act. Part 3. Dual capitals that stay behind networks. The British Empire, the largest in history, a quarter of the world's land and population, didn't dissolve when the colonies got their flags. It transformed. London and Washington became twin operating centers of a single English-speaking power, maintaining reach through financial networks, intelligence alliances, diplomatic leverage, and permanent military projection. That dual capital structure is where the real conflict lives. London and Washington aren't just allied capitals. They're rival headquarters of two factions inside the same civilization. The old imperial networks stay behind assets in finance, intelligence, security, politics, are the ligaments that hold this long war together. 1953. Iran was never outside the English-speaking world's reach. It was woven into it. In 1953, a joint CIA-MI6 operation overthrew Iran's elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. The reason? He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the ancestor of BP. His crime wasn't tyranny. It was claiming Iranian oil for Iranians instead of British shareholders. The Shah got a mafia offer. Join us, or your brother gets the throne. The Shah joined. Mossadegh fell. Iran's democratic experiment ended. But this story starts half a century earlier, with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, Britain's capture of majority control over Iranian oil production. From that point on, Iran served a specific function: a self-funding, City of London-aligned destabilizing force in the Middle East. Oil revenues that should have built Iran instead funded the architecture of regional control. The 1979 illusion. When the Shah fell and Khomeini rose, Iran supposedly escaped the Western orbit overnight. It became the enemy. But Iran's nuclear program didn't start under the clerics. It started under the Shah, with American encouragement. The offense was never enrichment. It was sovereignty. What followed was systematic, backing Saddam through the Iran-Iraq War, sanctions designed to strangle daily life, assassinations of scientists, cyber attacks on centrifuges. All of it built to maintain Iran as a pariah state, or the image of one, and force every oil-producing neighbor to pour 80% of its revenue into defense rather than development. A system designed in London, funded by Iranian oil, paid for with Middle Eastern lives. So, when you hear that today's Iran debate splits along pro-Israel versus pro-détente lines, that's cosmetic. The real division is between competing branches of the same Anglo-American imperial network, different hands of one organism. Today's strikes are a move in that internal game. One Washington faction using military force to eliminate the other's assets in the region and force a realignment. Part 4. The Cycle. Putney to the Persian Gulf. If linking a 21st century air campaign to a 17th century English quarrel sounds like a stretch, trace the institutional genealogy. The line from the Putney debates of 1647 to the bombing of Tehran in 2026 isn't a metaphor. It runs through real institutions, real ideologies, real inherited power. 1642 to 1651, the First War. The First English Civil War was a fight over who gets to rule and on what authority. At Putney, Colonel Thomas Rainborough said the poorest man in England has a life to live as much as the greatest. That wasn't constitutional theory. That was revolutionary. The monarchy came back in 1660, but the idea didn't go away. It crossed the Atlantic with the Puritans and lodged itself in the American character, a permanent suspicion of concentrated power. Session 1775 to 1783. The Second War. The American Revolution gets taught as a tax revolt. It wasn't. The men who led it were colonial elites, gentry, merchants, industrialists boxed in by London's mercantile system. They weren't rejecting English civilization. They were rejecting the particular power of arrangement that came out of 1688, a so-called Glorious Revolution that handed the English crown to continental financial interests. The Declaration of Independence reads like Rainborough at Putney, updated. Government by consent. Power from below. An argument as old as Alfred the Great. 1861 to 1865. The Half War. The American Civil War was the same fracture running deeper. North and South didn't just have different economies. They had different theories of sovereignty, labor, and federal power, all descending from 17th century English arguments. The Union won. That consolidated America as the dominant pole of English-speaking power. But it left open questions that still haven't been answered. The line to Tehran. Every one of these conflicts produced winners, losers, and stay-behind networks. Over centuries, those networks embedded in the institutions that came to manage the West's relationship with the Middle East, intelligence services, oil companies, banks, law firms, universities. The planners of Operation Ajax in 1953 were institutional descendants of the parliamentarians. The people debating Iran policy in Washington right now are heirs to these same fractures, carrying enmities that predate the Islamic Republic by hundreds of years. That's why this conflict never resolves. It's not a dispute between countries. It's a proxy war between two wings of the same imperial family, each using Tehran as a piece on a board whose endgame will play out in London or Washington in our lifetimes. Part 5. The Final Cycle. The Crisis. Turning Strauss and Howe described a recurring pattern in Anglo-American history. Each seculum, roughly 80 to 100 years, the length of a long life, moves through 4 phases: a high, an awakening, an unraveling, and a crisis. In the crisis turning, an old order is destroyed and a new one is built. The Revolution, the Civil War, the Depression, and World War II. Each was a crisis turning. We are in the transition between unraveling and crisis right now. Resolution comes around 2033, possibly later in the decade. The consequences will play out for the rest of the century. When the crisis comes from inside the civilization rather than outside, it takes the shape of civil war. 2 factions that polarized during the unraveling, each become convinced they alone represent the future. The result is internal conflict dressed in the clothing of external threats. That is what this Iran war is. Not an isolated strike. a major move in the endgame. The faction behind it didn't just hit military targets, it assassinated a sitting head of state, the first such killing since Gaddafi. It's using this conflict to consolidate domestic power, discredit rival networks, and clear infiltrated assets before the final resolution. Look at the fractures. Kane says he received zero notice. Not a briefing, not a call. He sits on both the Armed Services and Foreign Relations committees, and nobody from the administration reached out. The evidence suggests the Secretary of State phoned the Speaker of the House, and that was it. Kane believes the White House rushed the strikes to beat his scheduled war powers vote. The resolution failed along party lines, 47 to 53, with Fetterman, the lone Democrat, to break ranks in support. Senator Mark Warner, the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, said he saw no intelligence that Iran was planning a preemptive attack on the United States. None, and Trump ran the entire operation from Mar-a-Lago, a private compound in Palm Beach, not the Situation Room. Same place he ordered the Soleimani strike, the Syria strikes, the Houthi and Venezuela operations. That's not a national war cabinet. That's a factional command post using the machinery of the state. And when your own capital is compromised by a rival power center, a private compound is exactly where you run a war. Meanwhile, Iran's retaliation has been enormous. Over 500 ballistic missiles and nearly 2,000 drones launched at Israel, at US bases across Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and at Gulf state energy infrastructure. Saudi oil facilities are burning. Mojtaba Khamenei, the dead supreme leader's son, has been installed as his successor, promising the strikes will continue unless every American base in the region is closed. Hezbollah has reopened the Lebanon front. This is a regional war now, not a strike. And it's still expanding. Conclusion: the smoke over Iran hides more than it reveals. Seen one way, it's another sad chapter in the Middle East. Over 2,000 dead in the first 2 weeks, most of them in Iran, including children at a girls' school near Minab. Seen another, and this is the harder, more important reading. It's the visible edge of a 400-year English civil war entering its last act. If that's right, then treating Iran as a conventional adversary is a category error. The real question is which Anglo-American faction is using this conflict, and whether its victory will restore the civilization or finish hollowing it out. Washington faces the choice that every dual capital empire eventually faces: Constantinople or Rome. One path preserved classical civilization for another 1,000 years after the western half collapsed. The other ended in legions fighting pointless wars on distant frontiers while the core rotted from within. The answer won't come from Tehran. It will come from whatever settles the struggle between London and Washington, between the factions that built the modern world and the factions that intend to take it over. To know who these factions are and what they want, we have to go back to the event that created them, 1688. A revolution that got called glorious. In truth, it was the first hostile takeover of an English-speaking state by a new kind of power, the financialist. That's next. Subscribe.